Okay. All right, welcome. So we're starting Unit 4, and hopefully all of you have watched the art historical videos that go from the end of the Roman Empire, beginning of Christian art, and into all the way through the medieval period, all the way to the Romanesque, and then finally to um, the Gothic. And so in that time period, and I talked about how that's a pretty long time period, and we cover it very, very quickly just to kind of give you a sense of how we got from here to there. And because of that, a lot of what I focus on in that time period is in the architecture, because it's through the architecture that you can see a lot of the continuity as well as a lot of the development and changes. So since in that last art historical unit we looked at so much architecture, I figured it would be a good time for us to talk about architecture as a concept and as an art medium. So this slide lecture is all about architecture, which is building buildings and stuff like that. And one of the things that we should be thinking as we're going through this lecture is what is the difference between architecture and construction? When is building a building simply just an act of utility, and when is it an act of art? And that's not necessarily an easy dividing line to figure out. And so also this lecture has a couple of parts, right? A number of things that we talk about, but it's kind of it's organized around the basic idea of trying to figure out what is the purpose of architecture, or another way of saying it is what is the things that architecture does that really, when it does it well, it makes it art rather than simply just being something that, a thing to live in, or a building to hold an art department in. And so we talk about a number of things, and let's kind of cover each of the different main topics. So one of the things we talk about is the idea of load bearing and weight bearing, and about how for a lot of the history of architecture, the idea was, it was a lot about, the discussion about architecture was how the buildings communicate its ability to hold weight, and in what ways does it deny its holding of weight, and in what ways does it demonstrate the holding of weight. And that'll make more sense when we start looking at buildings. Another thing to really think about, and this gets related to the very first thing we're going to be talking about, the very first slide, which is that architecture is about creating spaces, and it's about creating spaces which you experience in time by moving through them. So we could call that another alternate theme about what is the importance of architecture. Another one that we get to at the very end of the lecture, especially when we're talking about modernist architecture, is the idea of utility, that serving people well is the thing that makes it art, right? Just like if you design a perfect cup, if you really put enough thought into making that cup absolutely perfect, especially absolutely perfect for that person, then that is art. Well, in the same way, if you made a building that served as as a hospital, and you designed it perfectly to meet the needs of that hospital, of that institution, then you have, that could be a definition of what makes architecture art. And along the way, we also talk about the way that architecture manipulates light and shadow. So those are the main things we're going to be talking about. And we're going to start primarily first by talking about the engineering aspects. But before we get there, I think it's kind of important to think about what were the thematic ideas that people had about architecture at the very beginning, when people first started to make buildings. Because I think it's important to remember that people had ideas about spaces before they were even building spaces, because people lived in spaces before we actually were making spaces. And what I mean by that is that, for the very earliest of art, we know that people went to caves and found caves, and then treated caves as holy spaces, and then participated in the caves as holy spaces. And we also know that people venerated groves, special places within a forest where there was an opening and there was maybe a special selection of trees, that those were considered sacred spaces. And also people did the same about mountains, especially the tops of mountains, with special beautiful views of space. And I think that when you think about that, that helps to explain a lot about the decisions people made in the very beginnings of architecture, the very earliest of architecture, because a lot of them seem to be organized around the ideas of a sacred cave or a sacred grove or a sacred mountain. And certainly a lot of people have commented that the circles, like Stonehenge or the other henges, do seem to have kind of a connection to sacred groves in a way. And they're also generally built on like slight hills, like at Salisbury Plain. So maybe they have an interest in, or some connection to interest in mountains. But the reason why we're talking about Stonehenge right here is because Stonehenge is perfect for demonstrating the absolute, in terms of engineering wise, the absolute beginning of architecture, which is post and lintel, right? The idea that one of the fundamental ways to build a building is to erect things to be uprights, things to hold weight, and then place other things that go across that span the weight from one side to another, and that by doing that you can build all kinds of buildings. So you can build something relatively simple, although not simple in construction, but at least simple in design, like Stonehenge, but you could build something incredibly complex like the Parthenon. It's all post and lintel architecture. So here's another example of post and lintel architecture. But I also want you to think about this. The funerary temple of Hatshepsut is also a great reflection of the idea of architecture mimicking the experience of the cave, in that the funerary temple of Queen Hatshepsut is built directly into a cliff wall and carves into the rock, becomes its own kind of man-made cave. And it's very processional, like you have to, it's all about the walk up to it. But it is also a beautiful example of Egyptian post and lintel architecture, and you can see that one of the things that post and lintel architecture does very well is that it looks solid. It demonstrates the holding of weight. You can also see another theme here is the idea of connecting statuary to lintels, which is an idea that actually goes even further back from here, or from Stonehenge, goes all the way back to Göbekli Tepe. But we're not going to talk about that in this lecture. And so here are two examples, the Parthenon as well as the Pergamon altar, that are more refined maybe, or more, definitely more complex versions of post and lintel architecture. And you can also definitely see the idea of the sacred grove again in the Parthenon. In fact, actually, if you really look at the Parthenon and the way it's situated on top of the Acropolis, really what the Greeks have in this organization on top of the Acropolis is a combination of all three of those themes. It functions a lot like a mountaintop in that it is at the top of a mountain, and that people have to process up to the top of the mountain to visit the temple involves a climb. It is like a sacred grove because of the way the temple itself functions on the outside around the columns. It's not all that well known that most temple life, most of the actual sacred rituals happen on, especially the public ones, happen on the outside of the temple. Only very, very private, secret rituals happen on the inside. But like a sacred cave, it also has a dark interior to be explored. Not only that, but the Acropolis had multiple sacred caves that were alongside the processional path that led up to the Parthenon. So a fantastic example of post and lintel architecture. And this is without any mortar, by the way. All these stones are just linked together by grooves filled in with lead to help hold them in place, but there's no mortar between any of the stones. Okay, that's the end of my first part, and I will get to part 2.